I want to start with something that sounds simple, but I promise you isn't. Who counts? Not who counts as a good person, not who counts as a citizen or a voter or a taxpayer. I mean, at the most basic level, who counts as someone whose suffering matters, whose pain registers, whose life, when it ends, is worth grieving? Because the answer to that question, who counts, determines almost everything else. Whether we help or look away, whether we legislate with cruelty or with compassion, whether we cheer at a news conference or feel sick reading it. And here's what the research tells us. That boundary, the line between who counts and who doesn't, is not fixed. It's not hardwired into us. It moves. And it can be moved deliberately by people who understand exactly how to move it. That's what this episode is about. It's called moral exclusion. And once you see it, you're going to see it everywhere, in history, in institutions, in the news, and if you're honest, in yourself. Welcome to the Long Debrief. I'm Adrian. This is a show about the systems we live inside, the stories we tell ourselves to survive them, and what happens when those stories stop being true. Today we're going deep into a concept from social psychology called moral exclusion. We're going to look at its theoretical architecture, its historical fingerprints, and its very active presence in American political life right now. Specifically in how the MAGA movement has systematically targeted immigrants and transgender people. I'm going to draw on the foundational research. I'm going to draw on documented political rhetoric and its real-world consequences. And I'm going to draw on my own history because I've been inside more than one institution that ran its own version of this. And I think that experience is relevant. This is not going to be a comfortable episode. I'm not trying to make it comfortable, but I'm going to try to make it precise. Because I think the most dangerous thing about moral exclusion isn't that it's done by monsters, it's that it's done by ordinary people. People who at some level genuinely believe they are the good guys. Let's get into it. In 1990, a social psychologist named Susan Opotow published what would become one of the foundational papers on this topic in the Journal of Social Sciences, or in the Journal of Social Issues. She defined moral exclusion this way. It occurs when individuals or groups are perceived as outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. Outside the boundary. Think about that just for a second. It's not that excluded people are necessarily hated, but it's that they are outside the boundary where fairness even applies, where rules govern conduct, where harm is visible as harm. When you're inside the moral community, when you're within what Opotow and others call the scope of justice, harm done to you is recognized as harm. It triggers moral concern. It produces obligation in others to respond, to intervene, and to care. When you are outside that boundary, harm done to you is unremarkable or justified, or simply not processed as harm at all, because the moral machinery that would register it has been disengaged. Morgan Deutsch, who worked alongside Opotow at Columbia, is one of the foundational figures in conflict resolution research. Put it this way. The narrower one's conception of one's community, the narrower will be the scope of situation in which one's actions will be governed by considerations of justice. Smaller moral communities equal smaller circle of who you'll treat fairly. It's almost mechanical. Here's what makes this so psychologically potent. It doesn't feel like cruelty from the inside. It feels like accuracy. Like you're simply describing reality as it is. They are criminals. They are invaders. They are a contagion. They are a threat to our children. You're not being cruel. You're being clear-eyed. This is the genius of moral exclusion, if I can even use that word. It repackages exclusion as discernment. And because it feels like seeing clearly, the person inside it rarely examines it at all. The concept of the scope of justice is worth sitting with for just a moment because it's doing a lot of work. Think of or think of it as a psychological boundary. Inside the boundary, people whose interests matter, whose suffering counts, and those who are owed fairness. These are people whose funerals you'd attend, the people you'd call a lawyer for, the people you'd feel implicated in harming. Outside the boundary, people who are perceived as non-entities, as expendable, and as undeserving. And here's the key word Opotow uses: not evil, not hated necessarily, but undeserving. As in, fairness doesn't apply to them. Rules that protect the rest of us don't extend to them. The scope of justice is not static. It expands and contracts based on conditions. Historically, it has expanded slowly, painfully, through struggle, to include people who were once definitionally excluded: enslaved people, women, children, LGBTQIA+ people, and people with disabilities. Progress, when it happens, is often the story of the scope of justice widening. But it also contracts, and contraction is much faster. It requires less sustained effort. It runs with the grain of certain psychological tendencies rather than against them. And it can be engineered by people who understand the mechanisms. To understand how this works at the psychological level, we need to go back about a decade before Opotow's work to Henri Teifel and John Turner's social identity theory, which was developed in the 1970s. Teifel was a Polish-born Jewish psychologist who survived the Holocaust and became deeply committed to understanding how ordinary human psychology enables mass atrocities. Not how humans behave, but how regular people participate in terrible things. He ran a series of now famous experiments called the minimal group paradigm. He took groups of teenagers, boys aged 14 to 15, and divided them into groups in the most arbitrary criteria imaginable. In a canonical version, the criterion was stated preference between two abstract painters, Klee and Kandinsky. And these kids had never met each other. They had no shared history, no prior conflict, and no competition for resources. And yet, when asked to distribute rewards between in-group members and out-group members, they consistently favored their own group. Even when doing so cost themselves points. They would sacrifice personal gain just to create a bigger gap between us and them. The finding is stark. Arbitrary categorization alone is sufficient to produce in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. No prior rivalry, no actual threat, just you are in this group and they are in that one. That is enough. Now, layer onto that everything that real political movements bring. The categorization is not arbitrary. It's hammered into people daily across media ecosystems, political rallies, social networks, and family dinner tables. It's backed by identity investments, economic anxiety, cultural threat narratives, and the psychological safety of belonging to something large and certain. The in-group, out-group divide doesn't just emerge under those conditions. It hardens and it becomes identity. And once exclusions become identity, questioning the exclusion feels like an attack on the self. And this is why moral exclusion is so resistant to rational argument. The categorization didn't come from facts. The facts were recruited afterwards to justify what the identity already required. Moral exclusion doesn't happen all at once. Opotow identified that it tends to move through stages, from conflicts of interest to group categorizations to moral justifications to unjust procedures, and finally to harmful outcomes. Each step normalizes the next step. Each stage makes the one that follows feel less like a departure and more like logical continuation. And at each stage, there are specific psychological tools being deployed. Albert Bandura, best known for social learning theory, the Bobo doll experiments, mapped these tools in his work on what he called moral disengagement. He identified 8 mechanisms through which ordinary people disconnect their moral standards from their behavior. And I want to walk through the most relevant ones today. The first is dehumanization, the most powerful and most dangerous mechanism. When a person or group is stripped of their human qualities, their capacity for reason, for suffering, for dignity, harm inflicted on them no longer triggers the moral concern it otherwise would. Nick Oslam identified 2 core forms of dehumanization. The first is animalistic, denying traits that separate humans from animals, culture, refinement, rational thought, moral sensibility. This is the propaganda image of the enemy as rats, cockroaches, apes, vermins. The second form is mechanistic, so denying warmth and individuality, treating people as objects, units, instruments, bodies and beds, head count, resources. Both forms accomplish the same thing. They close the psychological distance between a human being and a thing. And once someone is close enough to a thing in your mind, cruelty becomes not just possible but unremarkable. You don't have to actively decide to harm them. You just stop registering that harm is occurring. Neuroscience research supports this, and when people see members of an outgroup described in dehumanizing terms, the areas of the brain associated with empathy and social cognition show measurably less activation. Dehumanization is not just a metaphor. It changes the way brains process other people. Next is euphemistic labeling. Language is one of the most powerful carriers of moral disengagement. When you change the words, you change the moral weight of the act. Bandura called this euphemistic labeling, using mild or sanitized language to obscure the nature of what is actually happening. Civilian deaths become collateral damage. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation, surveillance becomes data collection, and people, human beings with names and histories and families, become illegals, aliens, an infestation, an invasion. Each of those words does the same psychological work. It removes personhood and replaces it with a category that the moral machinery does not process as human. Research on dehumanizing rhetoric in immigration discourse has shown that consistent use of disease metaphors, criminal taxonomies, and animal imagery to describe immigrants shapes attitudes over time, not through persuasion, but through repeated exposure. The language normalizes a perception, and once the perception is normalized, the policy that follows feels like common sense. Once the perception is normalized, the policy that follows feels like common sense rather than cruelty. Notice how much work the word illegal is doing. Not the person who crossed without authorization, not the asylum seeker, not the refugee, just illegal. The word takes a status, a legal status, a bureaucratic category, and collapses an entire human being into it. Their names disappear, their children disappear, their reasons disappear. What remains is a category that has already been pre-processed as outside the scope of justice, moral justification. This mechanism is particularly insidious because it feels righteous. Harm is reframed as serving a noble cause. You're not being cruel. You are protecting your children. You are defending your nation. You are standing up for real women, preserving your culture. You are doing God's will. The harm does not disappear under moral justification. It just gets laundered through a purpose that feels morally legitimate. And once someone believes they are doing harm in service of a higher good, the feedback loops that normally regulate behavior, guilt, shame, internal conflict, they just get short-circuited. Bandura's point is that moral justification reframes destructive conduct as personally and socially worthy by portraying it in the service of moral ends. The cruelty isn't despite the moral commitment. The cruelty is evidence of it. I've seen this up close in the military, in law enforcement, and in the religious communities that I grew up in. The people who could do the most damage were almost never the ones who knew they were being cruel. They were the ones who were absolutely certain they were doing right. Certainty is not a safeguard against harm. In the wrong framework, certainty is like an accelerant. I was just following orders. Everyone else was doing it. It's policy. It's not my call. The law requires it. This is displacement and diffusion of responsibility. When responsibility for harm is distributed across a system, across chains of command, bureaucratic processes, and collective decisions, each individual node in that chain feels less personally accountable. The person who processes the deportation order didn't make the immigration policy. The officer who enforces the policy didn't write the order. The legislator who wrote the order was responding to constituent demand. The constituent was just voting their values. No one person feels like the source of the harm. And so in a meaningful psychological sense, no one is. And that's why atrocities tend to happen inside institutions rather than in spite of them. The institution diffuses the moral weight until it is light enough for each person to carry without feeling it. This is Milgram's lesson from the obedience experiments. Today, I want to name it here because it is almost inseparable from moral exclusion. The mechanism of diffused responsibility is what allows large-scale exclusion to be operationalized through bureaucracy, through forms and processes and policy language without requiring that any individual person confront what they are doing. Next is attribution of blame, which is the final mechanism that I want to name, which is where you make the victim responsible for their own victimization. They brought it on themselves. They shouldn't have crossed the border. They shouldn't have been so visible. They made the choice. Attribution of blame is the last line of defense for the moral disengagement system. Even if harm is visible, even if the dehumanization hasn't fully taken hold, blame attribution allows the excluder to maintain a clean conscience. I didn't do this to them. They did it to themselves, which means their suffering is a consequence of their own choices and not a product of my actions. And the consequence of choices don't require a moral response the way harm from outside does. This is why every major exclusionary movement in history has paired its dehumanization with a blame narrative. The Jews were blamed for Germany's economic collapse. Enslaved people were blamed for their condition by attributing them to natural suitability for servitude. Today, undocumented immigrants are blamed for crime rates that research consistently shows they do not drive. Trans people are blamed for threatening the safety of spaces that research shows they do not threaten. The blame is not incidental. It is structural. It is doing the work of justifying the exclusion by making the excluded responsible for it. I want to be direct here. I'm not going to dress this in false balance. The mechanism of moral exclusion is universal. Any group can deploy it. And historically, many have across many ideologies. But right now, in the current American political moment, the most systematic and organized political deployment of moral exclusion is being run by the MAGA movement. And I think it is important to name that precisely because the framework is exactly what makes it legible. The two primary targets that I want to focus on today are immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers, and transgender people. And I want to show you how the same psychological architecture applies to both, because the parallel is not coincidental. It is instructive. Let's start with the rhetoric, because it's the most visible layer, and because it does real psychological work before any policy even arrives. In December of 2023, at a campaign rally in Durham, New Hampshire, Donald Trump told supporters that immigrants were, direct quote, poisoning the blood of our country. Historians and journalists immediately drew comparisons to Nazi-era purity rhetoric. Trump didn't walk it back. According to reporting from Rolling Stone, he privately vowed to intensify the language. He said that he was going to keep saying immigrants were poisoning the blood of the nation. He reportedly said that he had been too nice. At a rally in Vandalia, Ohio, in March of 2024, he referred to certain migrants as, direct quote, not people. These are animals. Defenders argued that he was referencing gang members specifically. But the language was sweeping enough that the dehumanization landed broadly, which is exactly how this rhetorical technique works. The line between some of them and them dissolves under repetition. And the next day, in a pre-taped Fox News interview on Media Buzz, anchor Howard Kurtz asked Trump directly why he used language favored by Hitler and Mussolini. Words like vermin and poisoning the blood. Trump responded, I didn't know that, but that's what they say because our country is being poisoned. He was asked if his rhetoric echoed fascism. His response was to repeat the rhetoric. This is not a gaffe. A pattern of language this consistent, this escalating, and this deliberately maintained is not accidental. It is the systematic application of animalistic dehumanization, Haslam's first category, to a group of people that the movement once placed outside the scope of justice, and it has a documented political utility. It binds the in-group more tightly, it justifies the policy agenda, and it licenses escalating hostility in the broader culture. The consequences are not abstract. Research by David Markowitz and Paul Slavic, published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, found that people who dehumanize immigrants feel less connected to them, describe them in impersonal terms, and endorse other social harms that have nothing to do with immigration, like the death penalty for unrelated crimes. The dehumanization is not specific to immigration. It is a generalized stance towards the outgroup that bleeds into every domain of moral consideration. And there is a direct line between the rhetoric and the violence. A peer-reviewed study by Karsten Mueller and Carlos Schwartz, published in the Journal of European Economic Association, found that anti-refugee posts by the AfD on Facebook predicted increases in violent crimes against refugees in areas with higher social media usage. The effect held up even when accounting for general AfD support, with causality reinforced by natural experiments during Facebook outages. Words create permission. Once the personhood of a group is stripped away in the cultural imagination, acts of violence against that group become more thinkable, more defensible, and more likely. The language was always in service of the policy, and the policy has been, by any historical measure, extraordinarily aggressive. In Trump's second term, beginning in January 2025, immigration enforcement was reframed as a military operation. On March 15, 2025, the administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which is a wartime statute previously used only 3 times in the U.S. history, all during declared wars. The administration used it to deport Venezuelan migrants to a maximum security prison in El Salvador called CICOT. The administration said 137 of the deportees were sent under the act. Reporting later established that many of those deported had no criminal records and were identified primarily by tattoos and social media. Federal courts repeatedly intervened. Judge James Boasberg issued a temporary restraining order the same evening. The plane still arrived. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the most conservative federal appeal courts in the country, later ruled the act could not be used against gangs like Tren de Aragua. The administration repeatedly continued the broader effort. The framing was explicit. This was an invasion. It was not immigration. It was not asylum claims. An invasion. A word that carries military connotations and therefore implies a military response, including the suspension of the normal procedural protections that the scope of justice would otherwise require. When you call it an invasion, you're doing moral exclusion work. You're placing the people crossing the border outside the category of people to whom due process, fair treatment, and basic legal protections apply. The rhetorical choice is a policy choice, and the policy follows. Families are separated, people are deported to countries they haven't lived in decades, or in some cases to countries they've never lived in at all. Asylum processes are dismantled. Detention conditions that multiple federal courts ruled unconstitutional, and each of these policies were not only tolerated, but were celebrated by a significant portion of the electorate because the moral exclusion had already been accomplished. The people being harmed had already been removed from the scope of justice, so the harm did not register as harm. It registered as the policy working as it was intended to. The exclusion of transgender people from the moral community operates through a different rhetorical structure, but it has the same underlying psychological mechanisms. Here, the primary tool isn't animalistic dehumanization in its most visceral form. It's the categorical denial, the refusal to recognize the personhood and identity of trans people as legitimate. You are not who you say you are. Your experience does not constitute a real category. You are a man pretending to be a woman, or vice versa. And that pretense is either a delusion to be corrected or a threat to be contained. Categorical denial is a form of dehumanization, although it is a subtler one. It doesn't call trans people animals. It just says they don't exist in the way they claim to exist. If your identity is denied, if the core of who you are is declared a fiction, then harm done to you in the name of correcting that fiction doesn't register as harm. It registers as intervention, as protection, as restoration of the natural order. Research on the psychology of anti-trans legislation has identified that the primary psychological constructs driving this rhetoric are gender essentialism, the belief that a gender is a fixed, binary biological fact, and what researchers call benevolent sexism, a paternalistic framing that claims to protect women and children while actually enforcing their subordination. The irony documented in the research is significant. The reasoning used to justify anti-trans laws is associated with outcomes that are harmful to the very groups those laws claim to protect. Social psychology studying this dynamic note that trans people function as a prototypical outgroup target for a specific reason. Gender is part of everyone's identity. If a cisgender person defines their own gender in rigidly biological binary terms, then a transgender person's existence doesn't challenge policy. It challenges the coherence of their own self-concept. Researchers call this in-group boundary protection. The perceived threat is existential at the level of identity. And when identity is threatened, the psychological response tends to be defensive and not rational. The harm done to anti-trans people in service of protecting that boundary is not processed as harm, but it's processed as self-defense. The legislative record on trans rights tracks the same arc as immigration. Rhetoric first, policy second, and then escalation. In 2020, fewer than 100 anti-trans bills were introduced in state legislatures across the United States. Most of them focused on sports participation. By 2023, that number had grown to over 500, according to the Trans Legislation Tracker and Cornell University documentation. By the time of Trump's second term, anti-trans executive orders had restricted military service, directed federal agencies to recognize only two biological sexes, moved to eliminate gender-affirming care protections, and targeted trans athletes in school. The framing across all of these was consistent: protecting women, protecting children, restoring biological reality. This is moral justification in its most refined form. The harm being done to trans youth already in crisis, to trans adults who had built their lives and careers within existing protections, was invisible within the framework, as the framework had already declared the trans identity to be a threat. When the threat is inside the person, removing the person becomes protection and not persecution. And notably, research published in Sociology Compass found that anti-transgender views tend to be held the most strongly by people who score highest on authoritarian belief scales. This is not a coincidence. Authoritarianism and moral exclusion share the same psychological substrate: deference to hierarchy, in-group conformity, punitive responses to outgroups, and low tolerance for the ambiguity that inclusive societies require. The MAGA movement is an authoritarian project. It is targeting. Its targeting of immigrants and trans people is not incidental to that project. It is central to the project. I want you to sit with this for a moment. The fact that the same political movement has run nearly identical exclusionary processes against two very different groups tells you something. And it tells us something very important. This is not about the specific characteristics of immigrants or transgender people. It isn't a policy disagreement rooted in genuine concern for public safety or women's rights. It's about the utility of having outgroups. Social identity theory predicts this. In-group cohesion is strengthened by outgroup contrast. The more threatening and morally contaminating the outgroup can be made to seem, the more tightly bonded the in-group becomes. The movement doesn't need just one enemy. It benefits structurally from multiple enemies. Each enemy reinforces the story that the in-group is under siege, that extraordinary measures are justified, that the leader who names and targets the enemy is the one keeping them safe. Eric Hoffer wrote in The True Believer that mass movements need a devil. Not just a program, not just a vision, a devil. Someone against whom the faithful can define themselves, measure their sacrifice, and justify their solidarity. Exclusion isn't incidental to the movement. It's load-bearing. Remove the devil and the structure weakens, which is why the enemy list never shrinks. It always grows. I need to stop here and be honest with you about something. I'm not talking about any of this from a comfortable distance. I've been inside institutions that ran their own versions of moral exclusion, and I never saw it while it was happening. And that matters for what I'm about to say. I grew up in a Beachy Amish community. If you know anything about plain communities, you know that the scope of justice, who counts, who deserves care, whose pain matters, is drawn very deliberately. The community is the boundary, and the boundary is maintained with enormous intentionality. Inside it, there is extraordinary mutual aid. If your barn burns down, the community rebuilds it. If you're sick, people come. If someone dies, the whole community mobilizes. The care is genuine and deep. I don't want to romanticize it, but I also don't want to dismiss it. There is something real about what tight moral communities create inside their boundaries. But outside of that boundary, the English, the worldly people, those who left, there is a lesser category. Not evil necessarily, just lesser. Their inner lives and sufferings and needs don't carry the same weight. When someone leaves the community, they are grieved as if they died. Because in a functional sense, within the scope of justice of that community, they have. They have exited the moral community. Their future pain is no longer the community's obligation. I didn't have language for that as a kid. I didn't know it was a constructed boundary rather than a natural one. It just felt like how the world was organized, which is how moral exclusion always feels from the inside. Not as a choice, but as a description of reality. The thing that troubled me, even before I had the framework, was noticing that asymmetry. The people outside the community seemed to suffer just as much as the people inside of it. Their grief looked the same, their losses looked the same, and yet the response was always different. It wasn't consciously cruel, it was just absent. The care that would have been mobilized for an insider just simply did not mobilize for an outsider. And the absence didn't feel like cruelty to the people not mobilizing. It felt like an appropriate boundary maintenance. That asymmetry stayed with me. It was my first real encounter with the question, what makes some suffering visible and other suffering not? And then I went to Iraq, 2006, 2007, the surge, 1st Infantry Division in Baghdad. The United States military is one of the most sophisticated moral exclusion machines ever constructed. And I don't say that as a condemnation, just simply as a description. Because I think most people who join the military, myself included, join for reasons that have nothing to do with learning to exclude people from the scope of justice. You join for service, for belonging, for opportunity, for 100 legitimate reasons. But the institution requires, as a functional necessity, that you be able to do things to other human beings that you could not do if you fully registered those human beings as equivalent to yourself. That's not a bug in the design. That is a design requirement of combat. You cannot send people into situations where they will be required to kill if those people are fully experiencing the enemy as fully human in the moment of action. Something has to give. And what gives is the scope of justice. The language tells you something. The vocabulary of dehumanization in combat theaters is not incidental soldier slang. It's functional. It does the psychological work of narrowing the scope of justice in real time under conditions where the narrowing is tactically necessary. It creates a psychological distance required for the mission to be executable. And here's the part nobody prepares you for. You come home and nobody helps widen it back out. The same psychological distance that made you operationally functional in a combat zone doesn't come with an off switch. The categories you learned, who is a threat, who is innocent, who is worth protecting, and who is expendable, it doesn't reset when you cross the border. You carry them back. And they interact with everything, with how you see strangers, with how you respond to conflict, with who you instinctively extend trust to, and who you instinctively read as dangerous. I'm not the only veteran who has said something like this. The research on moral injury is full of veterans who are not primarily traumatized by what was done to them, but by what they did, or failed to do, or watched happen, to the people who, in retrospect, they recognize as having been fully human all along. The scope of justice was contracted for the mission. The mission ended, but the contraction stayed there. That's a particular kind of wound, and it doesn't heal just because you leave the theater. 6 years as a deputy sheriff. And there too, the categorical sorting is everywhere. The training embeds it early. There are civilians and there are cops. There are suspects and there are citizens. There are people who fit the profile and people who don't. There are calls that are taken seriously and calls that are treated as a nuisance. And the sorting happens so fast and is so reinforced by the culture that most officers never examine it consciously at all. It just feels like reading the environment correctly. Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Whose account is credible? Whose pain is worth documenting? These are not neutral determinations. They are structured by the same in-group, out-group dynamics that show up in Teifel's research. But now with institutional authority behind them, the scope of justice in law enforcement is not applied equally. And it cannot be, given that sorting that happens in training. You are taught to read people through a framework that places some people closer to the center of the moral community than others. And the people consistently placed further from the center, people of color, homeless people, people with mental illness, people without economic or social capital, consistently receive less protection and more suspicion from the institution that is theoretically there to serve them equally. I'm not saying that every officer is consciously doing this. I'm saying the institution produces this outcome even when individual officers believe that they are being fair. The bias is in the frame, not necessarily in each individual officer. And that's what makes it harder, not easier to address. Because the person inside the frame doesn't even see the frame. They don't know that they're inside the frame. They just see what the frame shows them. And what the frame shows them looks like accuracy. Each of these environments, the Amish community, the Army, and law enforcement, contracted my scope of justice in specific ways. Each made certain categories of people less visible to me as full humans deserving of equal moral concern. And I didn't notice it while it was happening because it never feels like contraction. It always feels like clarity. It feels like finally understanding how things actually work. That's the most important thing I can tell you. The experience of moral exclusion from the inside feels like waking up, not falling asleep. So if moral exclusion is this widespread, this normal, this functional, embedded in institutions, most people consider legitimate, what are the conditions that make people more or less susceptible to it? And more importantly, what actually breaks it? Because I don't want to give you a diagnosis. I want to give you something useful. Research consistently identifies several factors that contract the moral community. Economic anxiety and perceived threat, real or manufactured, are significant drivers. When people feel that their resources, their status, their moral identity is under threat, the scope of justice tends to narrow. This isn't pathology. It is arguably an adaptive response. Groups under real threat do need to prioritize their members, but it means that manufactured threat narratives are extraordinarily effective tools for shrinking moral consideration. If you can convince people that they are under existential siege, you can get them to accept exclusionary policies that they would otherwise recognize as unjust. Authoritarianism is a second significant predictor. People high in right-wing authoritarianism tend to endorse hierarchical social arrangements, in-group conformity, and punitive responses to perceived deviance. The relationship between authoritarian belief and moral exclusion is not coincidental. They share the same psychological substrate. Authoritarianism makes in-group, out-group distinctions feel natural and necessary rather than constructed and contingent. Social identity investment is a third factor. The more a person's sense of self-worth, belonging, and meaning is tied to a particular group identity, the more threatening it feels when that group's boundaries are challenged, which means movements that successfully make membership feel essential, not just politically relevant, but existentially important, produce members who are highly motivated to maintain the exclusions that define the group. And then there's repetition. This is perhaps the most underestimated driver. Research on media exposure to dehumanizing language shows that consistent framing of an outgroup in threatening, impersonal, or subhuman terms shapes attitudes over time. Not through persuasion exactly, but through normalization. Each exposure moves the baseline a little. The moral community doesn't contract all at once. It contracts incrementally, each repetition making the previous level feel normal, making the next level feel like a modest step rather than a significant one. And this is what political theorists call the Overton window, which is the range of ideas a society considers acceptable at any given moment. And that window moves. And when it moves slowly enough, people move with it without noticing that they've moved at all. Opotow's foundational paper on deterring moral exclusion argued that dissent and pluralism are primary structural countermeasures. When diverse voices are present, when people who fall outside the excluded group speak up, when counter-narratives are visible and accessible, when the framing is contested rather than allowed to calcify, the contraction of the scope of justice is harder to accomplish and harder to sustain. That is why exclusionary movements work so hard to control information environments. It's not just propaganda. It is quarantine. Keep the in-group from sustained exposure to the humanizing particulars of the out-group. The rhetoric is the antibody against empathy. Research on anti-trans prejudice specifically found that anti-discrimination exercises, structured exposure to counter-narratives, and perspective-taking experience measurably reduce exclusionary attitudes in environmental or experimental conditions. The scope of justice can be widened deliberately with the right conditions. Empathy is not a fixed trait. It is a practice. It can be cultivated or suppressed depending on the environment. But the most powerful disruptor of moral exclusion, in my experience and in research, is individuation. Meeting the excluded person as a specific human being with a name, a history, children, losses, humor, context, complexity, all disrupt the categorical processing that makes exclusion possible. The category illegal or trans person or animal is designed to be held at a distance where individual humanity cannot perpetuate it or penetrate it. It works because it prevents the encounter. Bring an actual person into view, their actual name, their actual story, their actual face, and the mechanism fails. Not always, not instantly, not irreversibly, but it fails more often than an argument does. I think about the veterans that I served with in Baghdad. Many of us went in with clean, categorical thinking about who the enemy was. And then you spend enough time in a place and the categories start leaking. You see a kid on the street who's just a kid. You see a family that is just a family. The individuation happens whether you want it or not. And the moral exclusion becomes harder to sustain. Not because someone argued you out of it, but because you encountered actual people. This is why contact matters. Not superficial contact, not contact that reinforces existing roles and hierarchy, but genuine human contact. Contact where the person on the other side of the category is allowed to be complex, to be surprising, to be real. Prejudice reduction research going back decades shows this kind of contact is the most reliable path to narrowing the distance between in-group and out-group, which is, I suspect, exactly why exclusionary movements work so hard to prevent that contact. The rhetoric isn't just about framing the out-group negatively. It's about maintaining the categorical distance that makes negative framing stick. If you know immigrants as people, not as a category, but as specific human beings with specific lives, it becomes very hard to sustain the story that they are poisoning the blood of the nation. So the story has to be maintained partly by preventing the encounter that would dissolve it. I want to add one more thing here because I think it gets underweighted in these conversations. Institutions matter. Individual change, one person encountering another person and having their scope of justice widened is real and important, but it is slow and fragile. Moral exclusion scales because institutions scales. The military scales, law enforcement scales, media ecosystems scale, political movements scale, and they scale the exclusion with them, which means that disrupting moral exclusion at scale requires not just individual empathy cultivation, but institutional accountability. It requires asking, what does this institution's rules and culture and incentive structure do to the scope of justice of the people inside of it? Who does this institution systemically render invisible? What does this institution require people to not see in order to function? These are hard questions to ask from inside of an institution. They tend to feel like attacks from the outside, but they are exactly the questions that a society committed to actually widening the scope of justice has to be willing to ask. I want to close by naming what I think is the hardest thing about this topic. Moral exclusion feels like moral clarity, and that is a trap. To the person inside of the movement, calling migrants animals isn't cruelty. It's honesty about a real threat. Denying the existence of trans identity isn't bigotry. It's defending biological reality. The framework of exclusion has already been pre-processed. The categories in ways that makes the cruelty invisible to the person committing it. The excluded group isn't being harmed. They're being handled appropriately, which means the excluder doesn't need to suppress their conscience because their conscience is fully engaged and pointing in the same direction as the cruelty. This is why arguing about facts often doesn't work. You could show someone the data on immigration crime rates, which, by the way, consistently show that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. The Stanford economist Rand Abramitsky and colleagues have documented this across 150 years of U.S. census data. You can walk through the science on gender identity, which is far more complex than the political framing allows. You can present all of this clearly and accurately, and the person across from you might not move, probably won't. Not because facts don't matter, but because the moral categorization came first. The facts are recruited afterwards to justify what the identity already required. And facts that challenge the identity get filtered through by the same mechanism that filters out the personhood of the excluded group. This is what makes moral exclusion a psychological and social problem, not just a political one. You can't argue someone out of a frame they don't know they're in. What you can do, what the research supports, what my own experience supports, is create conditions for the frame to become visible, which actually requires contact or crisis or both. Contact with people on the other side of the category, or a crisis that disrupts the identity investment enough to create an opening for questioning. And neither of those is fast. Neither is guaranteed. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the answer is to have more conversations with people who want to deport your neighbors or legislate your existence. Sometimes the right response to moral exclusion is resistance, not persuasion. Sometimes the most important thing to do is to protect people being excluded, not to win over the people doing the excluding. Both things are true at the same time. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as accepting it, and recognizing the psychology of the excluder does not obligate the excluded to be patient with their own erasure. I want to end with what this means for those of us who've been inside exclusionary institutions, because I think that is actually where the most important work happens. The debrief, the actual unpacking of what you've been inside, is hard not because of the information is complicated. It's hard because you have to be willing to look at yourself and ask, who have I been failing to count? Whose suffering have I been processing as something other than suffering? Whose humanity have I been treating as conditional? The Amish community I grew up in had a boundary that I internalized before I had words for what a boundary was. The military gave me a framework for categorizing people that I carried home in my body. Law enforcement trained me to see some people as credible and others as not. And I didn't always question when that training was accurate and when it was biased. In fact, I don't think I ever questioned it until later. I'm not telling you this to perform accountability. I'm telling you this because I think the most honest contribution I can make to this conversation is to say, I know what it feels like to be inside the scope of justice that is too narrow. I know what it feels like when the contraction looks like clarity. And I know what it feels like to have that challenged, slowly, uncomfortably, over years, and to discover that the world was larger than the frame that I had been given. That is the work. Not the political work, though that matters, but the internal work. The expansion of the scope of justice, one person at a time. One encounter at a time, one honest question at a time. That is what I'm trying to do here. One debrief at a time.